Welcome to Architects for Change, the podcast that bridges the gap between architecture, the built environment and politics. I'm Jay Morton, your host. I'm an architect and political geek, and together we'll hear from the change makers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of our cities and spaces. Our conversations will tackle pressing questions that hold the key to our future. How can we achieve a net zero future? What does it truly take to design a better world? And most importantly, how can politics play a pivotal role in breaking down the barriers that hinder progress? So welcome Chris Young,
Hi.
AC, who is a planning barrister.
That's right.
So I think there's actually quite a lot we can learn from you, because obviously a lot of the people that I've interviewed so far have been architects and urban designers, but you're kind of coming from the built environment in a different angle, because you specialise in planning law with an emphasis on housing development, and you also have your own podcast called Have We Got Planning?
That is right, yeah.
Which
that
obviously
is.
everyone should listen to, and I'll put that in the planning notes. And I think part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you, I think you're quite candid, and I think you've got quite a few opinions on planning and the direction of travel and the things that could change. So I think there's quite an interesting conversation we can have.
I certainly have got views.
So, exactly. But before I say any more about you, maybe it would be great if you could introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit more about you and your journey into planning law and your outlook at the moment.
Okay, so I went to university to do geography. I started to then study politics as well. So I did those, at the end of which I was intent on doing a PhD. This is 1994, a little known subject called sustainable development. Hadn't really happened yet, but the University of Leeds had created an environmental department, which was entirely new in those days. And I got funding for a PhD, which I did for a whole week, and then decided perhaps I didn't want to be an academic. I didn't want to do a PhD. Had a big panic and a big crisis about what I was going to do. That was a difficult time. And then I read an article from a solicitor about environmental law, and I went to see him. He was in Leeds. And then I went to see the careers advisor at Leeds University, and I came bounding in like Tigger, as I can do sometimes. And I talked about being a solicitor, and she said, have you thought about becoming a planning barrister? And I had not thought about becoming a planning barrister. A lot of barristers you meet, they want to be a barrister since they're about the age of 4.
Oh, okay.
And that's all they've wanted to do. And they see that path very clearly all the way through. And I suddenly thought, yeah, actually, maybe I could do that. And I went to see all my friends, and they said, yes, that is perfect for you. You are so argumentative, which is true. And I just found my niche, absolutely found my niche. And as a barrister, you start out and you have to do lots of things. So I went to the magistrate's court and helped people get off terrible crimes like parking on a double yellow line. Went to the family court, got that badly wrong. My client went back to prison. So that didn't go so well. But I always wanted to do planning. Yeah. And I've just been unbelievably lucky, really. So that's how I got into it.
So what's your outlook at the moment, and what types of projects typically land on your desk?
Okay, so I'm very, very positive at the moment, because we've had a massive change in policy, probably the best change in planning policy ever, I think, ever since planning was really invented. It's got legislation, secondary legislation with lots of regulations, and then we have policy, and it's policy that really drives it. So policy is in the form of the National Planning Policy Framework. That's what we call it at the moment. Have that since 2012. Prior to that, it was planning practice guidance and planning practice statements. But that has just changed to just basically say we need to build a lot more in this country. We need to build loads more houses. So the government's obviously got a commitment to 1.5 million homes to be built, not just get planning permission. And then huge economic expansion. And we're seeing that already. We're seeing lots of permissions granted in places where the previous government wouldn't allow it, in the Greenbelt in particular, battery storage, new industrial buildings, new employments. Obviously, anything to do with employment's positive. And then housing is just seen as absolutely necessary. And if we're there to get to the numbers they want to get to, given the difficulties the previous government created, we are really talking about, by the end of this century, hitting 500,000 homes a year.
Yeah.
Which is, we've never done that. The most we've ever done is about 380,000. And that's with local authorities building huge numbers of council houses. So I'm really optimistic because the government has recognised it's good for the country, it's good for people, just grow.
So we've kind of gone from a government that's very much when not to build to a government that wants to build.
Yeah, I mean, people are very polite about the last government, but I think they were an unmitigated disaster on every conceivable level. I mean, I make no bones about that. And I used to write on social media a lot.
Yeah.
It used to really trouble me that people were sort of politely accepting the fact that local people, if they didn't want development in their area, could just say no. And the politicians were allowed to say no. And there weren't any housing numbers that were compulsory. And it was just a disaster, because what you're looking at is just the housing crisis getting worse and worse and worse. Not providing enough employment space, all constraining us. And there's this paranoid, I call it the Daily Fail, but it's a Daily Mail view that the country is nearly full, when in fact only, it depends what you read, the government says 11% of England is built upon, University of Sheffield says 6%. And if you ever happen to, as I have, flown in a helicopter from one end of the country to the other, you realise
there is a lot of space.
There's a vast amount of space, and a lot of people are naive and about or believing the fact that somehow this country hasn't got enough land, enough space. We've got massive amounts of space, and we need to build basically about 7 to 10 million homes.
But so obviously doing the role that you do, if we've now got policy that's pushing building forward and maybe hopefully makes planning easier, does that mean that there's less work for you?
No. Rest assured.
Good question.
No, you're right. No, it means that there will be a lot more work. So this isn't a work creation scheme that I've created or supported. But what I would say is that a lot of developers, a lot of house builders just think the odds are too risky. There is a reward for them. There's a reward for the landowner, a reward for the house builder. But if it looks too risky, because you're going to get turned down at appeal, get turned down by the local council, then you run an appeal, and the appeal isn't successful, or you get recovered by the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State says, well, this is a big enough scheme that I want to determine it. Then developers just won't make that investment. It's too risky. Now they are mobilising on a massive scale and making many more planning applications than they've ever done before. And building in places where, frankly, nobody thought you could build and may never be able to build, which is the Green Belt, round, London, round Birmingham, round Bristol, round Manchester.
Yeah. But so with that, even though it does feel like, I definitely felt that when the election was called, that we were at UK Reef actually, and there was that sort of energy of like, now we at least the sort of the policy, the sort of sense of we want to do this rather than we're going to do everything we can to stop this from happening. But that doesn't mean to say that even with the new NPPF there aren't barriers. What do you think those main barriers are to sort of really keep projects moving?
The biggest barrier is local people who already own homes saying, which were built on green fields on the edge of towns and cities, saying, we don't want any development in our view, or we don't want any development near us, or we don't want any development of great cars on our streets. That was not a problem in the 60s and 70s. Everybody was positive about delivering homes. Everybody accepted that. And what's happened is localism has come into the system. The previous government introduced it through legislation in 2011. Neighbourhood plans were there. The statutory tests for those are very low threshold. It's really what the community wants. And often the community doesn't want any development. They just don't want it, or they want as little as possible. And that's still a massive obstacle. So if my clients launch an appeal, it's going to cost them hundreds of thousands, maybe £500,000 to run an application for a few hundred houses that then has to go to appeal, and we have a public inquiry for 2 weeks. I am, involved in that process, obviously, but I look with dismay at how much the community is allowed to try and block that.
And does the NPPF go any way to prevent that from happening, or that's still there? Because I suppose we still have local planning committees, we still have councillors making decisions, which obviously there's one side of me that I'm very, very democratic, and I think it's really great that local communities have a say. But then sometimes there is also that element where a very small group of people who aren't trained on the built environment who are being sort of shouted at by those with the loudest voices to then sort of call down planning applications when actually in their communities they really, really need new homes.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say three things there. First of all, you're absolutely right about the loudest voices. So it's the people with the homes who don't want the new homes near them. And there are groups like Just Build Homes that are trying to... It is Millie Dodd, and Millie's doing a great job, and her whole team and the people behind that, because they are reaching out and trying to get a database of people who say, well, actually, I would quite like to live here. And that isn't, it's an asymmetrical planning system whereby those who have homes already exist are already voters, and of course councillors don't vote for new developments unpopular in the same way that turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So it doesn't work, and the people who want to live there can't live there. I've lived in rural communities where the people who grew up there couldn't live there. They were forced out, and they don't get a say in the vote for whether there should be new development in that rural community, because they've already moved out, so they don't have a voice. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that as far as the sort of democratic process is concerned, I think we need to be careful about thinking that empowering everybody to make decisions about everything is democratic. We don't make decisions that well, let's have a vote about whether you can have cancer treatment, or whether we should educate kids from a particular area. These are given facts. The number of houses we need is a huge deficit of houses. Just to give you an example, France has 7 million more homes than us. We have 300,000 holiday homes. They have 1.2 million. So we've got to take that million off because that's the difference. But for the same population, they've got 6 million more homes. That tells you, and I've often said that's the figure, that's how short we are. So where is the democracy in saying local people can say, well, we're not going to have houses in our area, when you've got a government that's been elected to deliver more homes? That's the democracy to me. Allowing people to make democratic decisions and referendum on every single thing that might affect that community is ridiculous. It's unworkable.
So do you say then the last government brought in the more sort of big society localism stuff?
Totally.
Including the neighbourhood planning?
Totally.
What's your view on that?
Total disaster. Total disaster. I won't be popular for saying that. There'll be people who say it's good, and sometimes if you're a developer and your site gets preferred, but I've also seen a lot of sites preferred that are in ridiculous locations. So to take a town like Ludlow, it wasn't actually a neighbourhood plan, but the local plan was built through individual community engagement. And what the residents chose were sites on the far side of the bypass with no connectivity to the town, instead of 2 sites inside the bypass. Now, that's the product of localism, which is to say, well, out of sight, out of mind. Those are the best sites. Then that's ridiculous. And actually, a lot of I'm not a planner, I'm a planning barrister, but a lot of planners would say what localism did was effectively try and dumb down the professionalism in the process, which would not be lost on architects. But let's go for something that doesn't involve the professionals, because the professionals are dangerous, and the professionals...
it's the experts again.
Michael Gove loves an expert, doesn't he? I mean, Michael Gove was a massive problem. I'm not hesitating to say any of this, am I? I think he was a massive problem. I think their whole embracing localism. And I think the biggest problem was once the genie was out, you can't put it back in. And it's very difficult for this government or any government to sort of turn their back on neighbourhood plans. It appears like a good thing, but you've got to say this community is one of 20 small towns in a district, and each of those has got to take their fair share. And if the whole purpose of the local plan is to say, well, we think actually it'd be better if you put it over there, out of sight, out of mind, then that's not working. If communities, I think the whole idea behind neighbourhood plans, which is communities would buy into development, buy into the process, and development would be something they're involved in rather than have done to them, that would have worked. But this is Britain, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, because I mean, that's the thing for us. We do a lot of community-led schemes, and they can be quite beneficial. But it is a professional who understands the built environment and also understands how to present built environment concepts and building concepts to local communities is one thing. I think the thing that I found with a lot of neighbourhood plans, particularly in some of the like rural areas where I'm from, near Chichester, you actually got a group of people who've got time with the loudest voices. So again, probably the
retired homeowners. I know these
coming up with these neighbourhood plans. When, like you say, back to the people who are basically just busy trying to put food on the table, get their kids to school, just treading water, trying to stay above water. Then they don't have time to contribute to a neighbourhood plan. And again, it's also, you're getting people who aren't really being paid. Sometimes they did bring professionals on board, but often you've got people who aren't being paid to put these together, when we've got amazing teams of master planners, urban designers and architects. And I think that's something that definitely was missed.
I mean, Michael Gove said, we listen too much to experts. I think we listen too much to Michael Gove and people like that, frankly. Experts, whether it's architects, master planners, urban designers, they have years of skill and understanding of all these things. And it's a real shame that people think that somebody who had no professional expertise, but, had maybe 40 years in another industry, thinks that they know better. They don't know better. Of course, their views should be taken into account. But let's be clear, it's the end product. And the third thing I was just going to say was listen very carefully to what the government and particularly Keir Starmer was saying, which is, and look at things like the new settlements policy statement, which is it's a subtle, but it's a really important change in direction, because what he said was, we are going to listen to local people, but we are going to make decisions on the basis of the national interest. Yeah. And that's the crucial thing. Yes, listen to people by all means, but don't start acting against the national interest. And that's what I think localism and neighbourhood plans started to do. They started to act in a very local interest and not the national interest. And the national interest is to house the people in this country. And also, obviously, the energy infrastructure. Completely. Well. They're massively behind on all that. And the battery storage and everything like this, the solar power. And, we are, by all accounts, the windiest country in Europe. And we should have unleashed it. And Ed Miliband was right to say it was ridiculous that we were stopping this, but we were stopping it because wind farms were in rural areas where Conservative voters and Liberal Democrat voters were. I mean, the Conservatives, to be fair to them, went for something positive, like the South Oxfordshire local plan. That was very positive. 8 large sites in the Greenbelt to be released for housing to help the local economy, which is red hot in Oxford. The Conservatives were just voted straight out of office by an alliance of Liberal Democrats, Greens and NIMBY groups. And so you can see the problem on a local level, which is why the government, I think, is doing brilliantly in suggesting devolution deals, which basically say, let's get rid of district councils and let's move to a county-wide structure. At least then you can plan for what's in the best interest of Oxford. And you align it more with the economic interests, the LEPs and the economic groups.
And I suppose this goes back to, I guess it's that having that strategy and actually the national interests that the democratically elected government puts forward, which is the bigger picture and the big strategy. And then everything needs to feed into that.
Totally.
Which I guess that's what's sort of been missing in the past 14 years, is that everything's quite disparate and nothing's pointing in the same direction. Right. And I think that's where you end up in sort of a bit of chaos and actually nothing gets done in the end.
It's been, chaos is the right word, it's been directionless chaos. And what they thought was do it all through, because the government that came in 2010 had promised to get rid of regional strategies, because regional strategies appeared to be top-down figures handed down. In fact, if you go properly through democracy, you realise that a government is elected to deliver the houses that we need, and the regional strategies were just an expression of trying to find enough of the best locations. You put more houses between Oxford and Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Bedfordshire, because that's less constrained than you do in, say, Sussex, where there's a lot more constraints. And that's what a national plan and a regional plan would deliver. And it's all then comes down, and then you get the right number for a Surrey authority or a Horsham. You get the right number because it's all been planned according to all the constraints. The idea that you can plan it out of a village neighbourhood plan somewhere on the south coast is just ridiculous. Farcical even.
So actually that brings it back to the sort of basic question of actually what is the purpose of planning, or what should be the purpose of planning?
Good question. I mean, it was originally brought in a post-war era. So we had the Bevin governments, and they were very much about planning for, what was in the national interests after the Second World War. And they built more houses and hospitals. The planning system really started to take expression, though, when Churchill came to power in 1951. He said in a speech in the run-up to the election, "You have told us," the people at top, "we want more homes. We want 300,000 homes a year. That's what we're going to deliver." And he put Macmillan, his very able minister, in charge of that. And Macmillan delivered more than that, in fact. And planning really is about meeting the national needs. And post-war, obviously, there was a huge amount that needed to be done. But there was a massive amount of recognising we've got all these men and women who had served and risked their lives, and those that came home needed homes for heroes. And that's what they called them, and they built the homes. And some of those prefabs that were meant to last 10 years are still there decades later. We should be thinking like that. We should be thinking about, they're not heroes who went to war, but all the people who work in the NHS who went through COVID, and all the teachers who go into, schools and deal with all kinds of difficulties every day. If we can't house our own people and do it in a way that is appropriate. And what I mean by that is when you've got a huge deficit of housing, it's just economics, demand and supply. So we've got massive mortgages, we've got massive rents. It's ridiculous. And all of that is a byproduct of being millions of homes behind where it should be.
So now we've got this target for 1.5 million homes. You've already mentioned this. What did we say? We need to get to about 500,000 a year.
By the end of the century, by the end of the decade.
By the end of the decade. Are you optimistic that can be achieved, or what do you think are the sort of biggest hurdles to achieve that?
I am optimistic because I think the biggest hurdle that's been staring everybody in the face for the last 50 years is the green belt. The green belt is absolutely absurd in the sense that when it was brought in, the London authorities, or whatever the combined authority was for London, wanted a 5 mile wide green belt. And what we've now got is 20 miles around most cities, because lots of authorities in Surrey and Kent and the home counties all say, "Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good way to stop development." And so you have this absurdly massive ban, which has got nothing to do with stopping London from growing. It's ridiculous. And what the new government has said is basically Greenbelt is not a justification for not meeting your housing needs. Every authority in the country is allowed to not meet their own housing needs, which just sounds bonkers to me. We've got a massive deficit. The numbers need to be bigger. Surely everywhere meets its own needs. No, if you've got Greenbelt, you don't have to. So the government have signalled, and they've done it, in a very clever way. They've identified grey belt as something where it's not what it sounds like in terms of car parks and quarry sites. That would deliver some of it, but it's actually saying where there's still going to be a very legitimate green belt left, and bear in mind how wide it is, you can build on those areas. So there'll be expansion. There should be expansion round the edge of London, round all the towns, and that is the single, I think, greatest thing. The only issue is the timing. How long will that take? Planning takes a long time. I think we'll definitely hit the 300,000 by the end of this Parliament. Whether we've got figures high enough to make the whole 1.5 million, It's a Parliament figure. It's a figure for the whole of Parliament, not 300,000 each year and every year. I don't know, but I remain optimistic because the people I act for the most are the major house builders and developers, and they have, and I've been speaking to all of them this week.
Are they optimistic? Is a question.
Yeah, I think they are businesses. They want more help. They want help to buy to come back, to help first-time buyers. The government wants home ownership. Keir Starmer said he wants home ownership to go reverse the trend that it was originally going. I first advised Boris Johnson's government and the number 10 policy unit when it was going the wrong way and Boris couldn't work out why. The answer was we were building loads of flats, which are great. If you go to Manchester and obviously lots of parts of London and now Birmingham, fantastic, but they don't deliver family housing, they don't deliver affordable housing, and home ownership is sliding because there's huge amounts of build to rent, which we need, but it isn't a home ownership dream that certainly all the parties I think want. So they are, and as I say, I've been speaking to all of them the last couple of weeks. They're all massively mobilising, and
I mean, this is good for architects to hear.
Yeah.
It's definitely felt like wading through a treacle for the past couple of years, and even this shit still feels a bit slow.
Yeah, that's it. I think the major house builders who've been advised by people like me and others can see what was coming, and started to make the investments and start to gear up. So Barratt, for example, was a client of mine. Barratt's a major house builder. They've got, they'd usually put maybe 20 planning applications in on their big strategic sites. They get their sites from lots of different people, from your Gladmans and your Richborough estates, the land promoters, but they'd always sort of put 20 applications in on their own sites. But last year they put in 40. And remember, we only had the government for 6 months. And then next year they're going to put in about 180. So huge increase. And then other house builders, I spend a lot of time looking at sites all over Essex and Kent and all these places where they want to build new communities and huge urban extensions with thousands of houses in. And the beauty of that, and what I always use to describe the Green Belt, is actually the Green Belt as a sovereign wealth fund, like Norway or Saudi Arabia have with their oil. It's a sovereign wealth fund that unfortunately the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats couldn't touch because their voters live in it. However, it is something that this government, which is not so dependent on votes in those areas, can mine. And what comes out the ground is not just houses, but actually huge amounts of additional uplift in land value to deliver secondary schools. I did a scheme for Tony Pidgley at Berkeley. Sadly, now Tony's gone, but we delivered 400 houses in Guildford, Guildford Borough, in the Greenbelt, and that was enough to fund 20% affordable housing and a £64 million secondary school, 10 form entry, just off those 400
that
houses.
Whole land value capture. It's almost like the Garden City thing.
It is. And you don't need to legislate for that. That comes through the Section 106 money. But I mean, that was a deal that Tony did, which basically said to this headmistress, I'll build you a new fantastic 10 form entry school for your 1,000, 2,000 students, as opposed to the tiny one you're in now. If we do a land swap and we put some land on, put some houses on that land. And so it isn't just about houses. It's about being able to deliver loads of new schools, loads of new sports facilities, something I did in Tring in Dacorum Council in Hertfordshire. 18 sports pitches, a new primary school that Red Row will just build themselves, a secondary school site, 36 hectares of ecologically enhanced area around the site, all of which the inspector thought was great, but Michael Gove said no. So you can see why I've got a problem with Mr. Gove. It was, and the council had like a 2-year housing land supply. It was so obvious to grant planning permission, even though it was in the Green Belt. And Mr. Gove just looked at the election results and looked at the voting and just went no.
Wow. I mean, this is the thing. I think that's the bit that's missed a lot when people are going against planning applications. Actually, the other benefits that that local communities can start to see, and actually that understanding of what good placemaking is. And maybe I think part of the challenge with particularly that NIMBYism against new builds is some of it has been quite bad historically. So I think that's where, again, it's like bringing good design and good placemaking, more experts.
Yeah, well, it is, and I think if you're a little bit geeky, but if in the MPPF it talks previously and still does, if there's a land supply problem, which now there's new much higher housing numbers for all the shires, it's still high in London, far higher than they've ever delivered. They've delivered about 40,000 in the best years. I think 36,000 generally. London has been told to deliver 90,000 homes a year. So nobody's going to, run out of ideas for building tower blocks in London.
Yeah.
But the numbers double in Surrey and Essex and round Birmingham in Bromsgrove and Worcestershire and Staffordshire. So huge increases in numbers. And with that, huge amounts of infrastructure, and really at a time when, the cupboards look pretty bare for the government. This isn't 1997. This isn't when Tony Blair came in and John Major had taken really good care of the economy. We've had Liz Truss, and we are paying the price of that, or as the economists have said, we're paying the price of
She might sue you.
She might do, but the economist said it's a moron premium. Then I guess I'm just quoting a journalist.
This is true. It's not you saying it.
I'm not saying it allegedly. It's not allegedly. It's what the economist said, the moron premium. And so what we've got is a situation where it just feels right now like a great weight has been lifted and that people can do what they want to do. And what I was going to say about the MPPF, that policy is where you've got a lack of land coming forward, which is basically everywhere. You must optimize the use of that land. And what that means is house builders, major house builders have already started to do this, but they're going to have to do this on a much bigger scale, is start thinking more about their architecture. They're going to have to think about what they're designing. 2.5, 3-story, probably fine in market towns. But when we're looking at a lot of land coming forward around the major cities, like Bristol, like London, like Birmingham, we're going to see more 4, 5, 6-story, closer to the city edge.
Soft density.
Well, and that requires moving away from a lot of very similar type houses and standardization, and actually moving to a much more varied type of architecture.
So it actually should start to get a little bit better, and there's probably more role for architects in that as well.
I would say definitely there is, definitely. And I think councils are going to insist on that as well. What they mustn't do is the government mustn't over-regulate to the point where it becomes too expensive, because people have got to buy these houses, But definitely, I think we're going to see a much wider variety of house types.
I suppose there's a few... there's the other thing that they've also pushed through with more planners, which is also a good thing. I think the big one on our... What we're seeing that might hold things up is the Building Safety Act. With a lot of the taller buildings. But I guess that's when, if we are getting more, pushing through more rural locations where everything's below that limit, then we can start getting them going quickly and then work out what we're doing with the Building Safety Act, because I think there's not enough regulators at the moment, and a lot of projects are going to be stalled, which is another big risk for developers.
Absolutely. I mean, I have heard about this. I have no expertise in it. I've heard that the number of people who could be in building control and helping deal with this is suddenly diminishing rapidly, and that's a big concern. And it's the same in planning. There's not enough planners. And when it gets busy, then what happens is the house builders and the other developers, they will choose staff from, say, consultancies. Consultancies choose staff from local authorities. Now the local authorities got less planners. And it's great that the government said we're going to fund 300 planners, but that's only one per authority in the country.
That's not that many.
It's not that many, no. They've got to be careful about what they say. They've got to be careful about their budgeting. But in truth, I think most developers would say, well, we're happy with the increases in fees that have gone on and just come into force. Probably take even more, frankly, if they knew they could get a better service. But you can't suddenly just have a higher fee and not have the officers to do that. My sister's a planning officer, and there's all kinds of issues there. She's been doing it for 30 years. She's seen social media grow. She's got hardened to it all. Younger officers come in, and the amount of abuse that planning officers get about,
imagine it.
My kids are going to die because you're going to allow this development of 6 houses because there'll be more traffic. And it's, it's really ridiculous, but it can be really upsetting for people. And, there's a lot that needs to be done to, I think, respect the professionalism of planners, which has been massively absent. But then I'm probably speaking to the converters.
Well, I think, I mean, that's something we would say, that I think there definitely needs to be more conversation with the industry, with urban designers, with master planners, and with architects. And also, I think, recruiting planning officers, but also for local authorities, not just in the big cities, but in the more rural locations, having more of that strategic expertise as well to do the sort of national plans, not just neighbourhood plans. Communities are doing. I think that could actually start to sort of make things move a bit quicker.
Yeah.
But so you seem quite positive about the MPPF. Is there anything that you think is missing, or that you'd like to see the government do?
I mean, I would say that local plans have to meet their needs. And at the moment, there's still ways around that. There's still ways of sort of saying, well, we don't want to because of constraints. Not the Greenbelt, which is the big one. But bear in mind, if the University of Sheffield is right and 6% of the country is built on, 12% of the country is covered in Greenbelt. So an area twice the size. So and these are all the locations where houses should obviously go. They're the most sustainable locations, where you get the biggest uplift in value, the most benefits. So that's a huge burden that's been lifted. And the government, frankly, this government has been very brave to go into an election even saying that. Mayor Khan would not even sanction the idea of touching the Greenbelt, even as a Labour politician. So for the National Party to go ahead and do that was very brave.
Because I guess where the votes for Sadiq come from more from the centre, for Labour come from more from the centre, and then the outer boroughs end up kind of deciding the mayor, which is this is where the sort of politics comes back into play and means things don't necessarily happen.
And planning is politics. I mean, let's make no bones about it. We wanted me to identify the single biggest break on development and meeting the country's needs is planning, and I said, well, that's my area of expertise. I would say that, but I look at it in absolute dismay at how much we stop and how much we hinder meeting our own needs. It's ridiculous. I mean, in the rural areas, for example, there are lots of excellent planners, planning and master planning, but it's the developer who comes in and has their proposals, and then the community and the planners and the councillors all suggest it. But a lot of what's done is amazing, actually. Huge amounts of sports facilities, open space. If you go to these new developments, and I've acted for local authorities in local plans and developers on big schemes and new settlements, a lot of them are amazing. They're places you'd really want to live. Of course, we can always find bad examples and soulless places and bad architecture, but an awful lot of it is really, really good. And it's certainly a lot better than the 1960s, 70s house I grew up in, which was functional, shall we say.
Okay. And not much else.
No. I mean, you didn't get affordable housing, you didn't get any open space, you didn't get play areas, and you certainly didn't get loads of sports pitches and all these kind of things. Unless it was on a very big scale. Generally, development just came forward as houses. That's it.
Yeah. So actually, this is a good question, even though you don't work in, so you're not an urban designer or master planner, but you personally, what do you think makes a good place?
I think that you need to. So I'm a bit of a sports fan.
Okay.
And
I'm getting a little.
Here's to that. And my kids play loads of sport. And a lot. So that's my total weekend is sport. And they're playing often to quite high levels. And what I think really binds a community is these, whether it's sport or, the bridge club or whatever it is, I think these activities bind communities. It's increasingly difficult to build a new town and put lots of retail in it because the retailers don't want to go there. What actually makes the community is all the groups and all the clubs and sport. And so that's what binds it. So what you need is you do need obviously a shop and things like that in the centre of a big new development of 1,000, 2,000 houses. But you need schools because they, a great expression I heard was that, if you're building a new town, for example, and I'm involved in about 20 of them, you don't want to be exporting your secondary school children every day to some other community. You want to keep them in that community.
It's really important for parents, actually.
Really important, and the interaction.
Morale.
And then the sports facilities are then used in the evening. So Redrow built a development on the edge of the town where I live, Cheltenham.
Yeah.
Fantastic school came along with it. There's more development by Miller Homes. But the AstroTurf that was delivered is extraordinary, where my son trains and does his football there. And there's like 7 parallel pitches.
Yeah.
And we're only a town of 100,000 people. And then the sports club, which is about a mile away, his football club, got a huge amount of money, about £400,000, and they bought the land off the council and completely redeveloped the site for football. And that's now touching hundreds of people, thousands of people in the community, because there's 22 teams or whatever there is. And it doesn't have to be sport. It can be lots of other things. But I think you need the buildings and the infrastructure.
Yeah.
The sport is a very obvious physical manifestation.
Yeah.
Centred around the secondary school and community buildings, those kind of things. And once you've got that, then you don't necessarily need a whole parade of shops, you know, with a kebab shop and a nail bar and all the rest of it. That doesn't really make a community. What makes a community is the clubs and the schools and the facilities.
I suppose place anywhere where people can come together. That's not necessarily about spending tons of money, ways that they can meet other members of the community and sort of form that kind of bond.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I coach rugby, and some of my best friends are the other dads. We tend to have one mum for a while, but lots of dads who coach rugby. All of the parents involved in the clubs, you know, when I'm standing on the touchline, those are some of the people I have the funniest conversations with, and that's a huge part of my life, really. Not the time I'm spending going shopping or anything like that. So I think what you'd need is obviously the houses. You need them to be well designed. I think you need a greater intensity around that centre. I think everybody accepts that. Angela Rayner has talked about sort of Edwardian style developments, and I think, you know, that's done well by some developers. Even in rural areas. I've seen it in Dorset, a developer called Wyatt Homes delivering some fantastic architecture. But I think at the same time, you have to recognise that, you know, what really binds that community is all the facilities that they then use on a day-to-day basis.
All the spaces between.
Absolutely, spaces, that's it.
So do you feel, we talked about experts actually, do you feel the government are listening to the industry enough?
Totally. I mean, we've got a minister at the moment called Matthew Pennycook, and I have met lots of politicians. And what usually happens, in my experience with politicians, is they'll talk to you, and you'll look very interested, and I'm interested in you, and then you'll start speaking, and they'll look over your shoulder to somebody more interesting in the room that they might, you know, they do suffer that. And with Pennycook, it's not like that at all. He listens all the time. And I think that's, you know, something that's really interesting. And he listens to everybody, you know, so I'm just somebody who's offered some views about housing, but he's speaking to everybody, community leaders. He's speaking to local authority people. He's speaking to developers, land promoters. And I think when you've got ministers who are willing to listen and listen to professionals in the same way that select committees do, because they choose people to come who are experts, I think that's terrific. And you get a very informed decision. They have to balance it with the local politics, of course they do. Not everything in the new MPPF is exactly what, you know, I would want. But when you think about where the change of emphasis has gone, it's definitely because they've listened to experts about the scale of the housing problems. Crucial example, all the housing numbers for every district and every borough were predicated for about 5 decades on household projections. And without being too geeky about it, household projections are what they say on the tin. They're a projection of household growth. So once you suppress household growth, you cause a lot of people in their 20s and 30s not to form a new household until later on. Then your household formation rates go down, and so do the projections. And they get lower and lower and lower. And the last government started having to abandon them or add figures or add a percentage to them because they were wrong. What we needed to do which the previous government were told about 4 years ago by me and others, is get rid of the household projections. They're pointless. All you're doing is projecting downward trends in household formation. Instead, look at the stock of houses in a town and work out how much more you need to add each year. That is exactly what the government...
I guess to sustain the population, because I suppose the thing, like you say, because part of the whole thing that the right have been starting to criticise is women my age and younger not having enough children, which is starting to sound quite dark, actually.
It
was sort of towards the last election, a lot of that was starting to come out.
I heard of MPs who really lost the plot.
And but you think, well, but you have been voting against policies that actually create the economic scenario.
You see, that's your first mistake. You're applying logic.
And
that won't do.
If you're not helping houses get cheaper, if you're not helping childcare get cheaper, then why are you surprised? And like you say, then the household projections go down because everyone's having children later, and then we're also being criticised for not having children at the right time. So maybe that will shift.
I think there's a number of things there. Just to unpack that, there's obviously changes in society which are much wider than how much housing, but housing hasn't helped. The lack of housing, living in your parents' house, that is not going to... It's not conducive to starting a family.
It's fine.
To starting a family, you haven't got the space and many other considerations. So the point is, there is a practical level of that as well as wider considerations. And really, it's very, very expensive. Housing is incredibly expensive. That's why most people live with their parents.
With childcare. If your mortgage or rent is, over £1,000 a month or £2,000 a month, then you add the cost of £1,500, or I think it's now more like £1,700 a month childcare. That is already a significant chunk.
You know what? That's a really good point, because the childcare is the cost it is. If we want certain ratios, we want to pay people proper wages.
No, exactly.
Then and it's a difficult job, let's be honest. Looking after a room of screaming toddlers wouldn't be for me.
No, not at all.
And so that's a legitimate cost. What is not a legitimate cost is to say that, up to half of people's income is going on their housing, which is ridiculous. It should be far less
to
than
put
that.
A roof over your head so you can go to work.
Totally. And I'm a bit passionate about this, but I really think housing and the lack of housing and the price of housing is at the root of so much that's gone wrong.
A lot of social problems can be solved. I've always said this as well. Access to a good quality home. Kids can do better at school. You have less travel time. You have more time, better health and well-being, more stability, ability to take risks actually as well. I think we'll probably get more entrepreneurialism. Because if your housing costs aren't so high, then you might be like, well, actually, maybe I'll go down to 4 days a week or quit my job for a few months and then be a bit more entrepreneurial.
I'd never thought about that, but I bet that does. I bet having that secure basis that isn't, absolutely bleeding you dry financially would liberate people.
Totally, I think so. So you already said you are quite optimistic. Where do you think the industry maybe will be in maybe 2 years' time? Where do you think we'll be? Do you think we'll be on track?
I think we will be on track. I think we'll be delivering huge numbers of houses. I think there'll still be all the frustration about how long it's taking. But we'll see the planning applications going in. We'll see it's already happening, and it's going to just gather pace and gather momentum. And there'll be loads of applications in, and of course there'll be lots of objections. What I know the government wants to do is try and have good local plan coverage, local plans delivering what they want. The trouble is the politicians in the areas where they don't want the housing are continuing to go what they've done for the last 14 years and longer, frankly, decades, is just slow the process down. And I think the government needs to be really firm with those councils that don't have a plan. At the moment, if you're a developer and the council haven't got an up-to-date plan, or they haven't got a 5-year supply of housing land, then there's something called the presumption in favour of sustainable development, and you're more likely to get planning permission.
Right, okay.
But only more likely. And then you're investing £500,000 on something that's more likely. And I mean, literally, developers come in and say to me, what are the chances of success? Every barrister will be asked that. And you're meant to say your chances are 40% or 60%. And then they can assess that risk. And really, I think what needs to happen is people need to be told you've got a 90% chance.
Yeah.
It's not going to be everywhere, but you're pretty much likely to win. If you have an application, it either gets granted or you go to appeal and you win the appeal.
I suppose that's the other thing as well. All this cost adds to the cost of the product in the end, doesn't it? Everyone does have to make a profit.
They do, and the land promoters, for example, don't build houses, but they take a lot of risk and can be turned down. And it's been a hugely frustrating process for them. And a lot have found it incredibly difficult. I think they're going to find it a lot easier.
So in general, optimistic.
I'm unbelievably optimistic.
Well, this is good for reason.
I'm unbelievably optimistic. What I'd like to think is that the current government get 2 or 3 terms so that the product of what they're doing now isn't being realised by the next government.
Well, yeah.
And they say, oh, it's down to us. We saw in the Daily Telegraph last week them blaming Labour for the lack of new planning permissions, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
I mean,
they've only just changed government and planning applications take time to prepare.
Yes.
Or the evidence, the ecology. You can only collect certain ecological evidence at a certain time of the year, usually the spring.
Yeah.
For newts and things like that. So, the Daily Telegraph was so far wrong, it's unbelievable to blame the current government for the fact that
6 months.
Yeah.
7 months.
They can blame them in 2029. They cannot blame them now. All the problems we're having now are down to Liz Truss, Michael Gove, localism, and just that general feeling that the only way they could respond to Liberal Democrats was by offering to provide less houses than the Liberal Democrats, who were trying to provide less houses than the Tories. And that's
just spiraled.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. I think we can probably leave it there.
Okay. Right.
But that was really, really good. Thank you very much.